Yeah, I would just strongly disagree there. I mean, because again, this is the kind of things that we see in normal conversation. And that's why you say, like, as far as the criteria goes or different things like that, it's based on what we do know, not what we don't know, which is how these things, how eyewitness testimony actually looks and sounds and the texture of it. And then it's the fact that just because, again, we can think of redactional reasons why they added like theological meanings. Usually, when there's theological, like they're really trying to reference the Old Testament or they're really trying to say something about Jesus, like they tag it, they mention it, they go out of their way explicitly. When John at the crucifixion talks about Jesus's not one of his bones were broken, and then he highlights a particular scripture passage. Okay, Matthew does this stuff all the time with like the flight to Egypt and different things like that. Now you could say that those stories are completely made up or whatever, but the point that I'm making is, which I would argue that they are not, but the point that I'm making here is that when they are doing this kind of heavy theological like inferences, they're pointing it out. They're being pretty explicit about it. When they're just talking about what they're reporting, like they're not doing that. And so we just have to assume that's just kind of what they're doing from the get-go. And what I'm saying is this kind of evidence counts exactly against that particular hypothesis. We can't just come to the table assuming that they redacted because, well, we just, by golly, scholars say that they redacted. This is the kind of evidence that works against that particular hypothesis, right? And again, when we can kind of always come up with a theological explanation for everything that looks like what could be an undesigned coincidence, that doesn't explain that the two interlock, and then it doesn't explain the casualness. And then the problem is that you have to come up with these rescues over and over and over again, which sounds to me like it becomes very ad hoc. And so I think that's kind of the biggest problem with the critics of undesigned coincidences is that they just haven't really, I don't think people have quite grappled with the argument. I'm not saying you haven't, but I have not seen like a very, I don't know. It's always redaction or it's always some other thing. And it's just like, these to me don't seem like any more probable than the hypothesis that you're making. I did want to mention one other thing, and then I'll let you respond, and then maybe we could get some questions, or I might, we'll kind of wrap up a little bit here. When you talked about the feeding of the 5,000, and it's just like, well, it's Elijah and Elisha, right? And we do see something like that in the Old Testament. Well, I mean, Jesus could have just acted that out. Just because like something is similar doesn't mean that like Jesus would have done something like that deliberately, to say like, hey guys, I'm a prophet, I'm even a better prophet than these guys. And so that kind of gets us into a discussion about miracles and different things like that. But I don't see that just because he's acting in a way similar to them, that gives us grounds for thinking that the event was just completely invented whatsoever. And so I just wanted to address that real quick. So anyways, I've given you a lot. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, I was just going to say on your last point there. Now what convinces me of that is actually Randall Helms's Gospel Fictions. I don't know if you've
I've heard of
read that
Randall
book.
Helms.
Yeah.
I've read that book.
He's okay. Well, I mean, the book is interesting if you ever get if you ever really look into it. What Randall Helms does in his book is he looks at the actual Septuagint Greek phrases, right? And he compares them to the New Testament. And he can pull out exact phrases that connect, not just like one or two, but like multiple different phrases that connect the Jesus story, especially the one in Mark, where it first came about. I mean, you can connect whole phrases between the the Old Testament story of I can't remember if it's Elisha or Elijah. It might have been Elisha. But he connects whole phrases. He also connects the progression of events. Like if you lay out the progression of events are exactly the same in both stories, which is an indication of copying and changing, parallel of a parallel happening. So with the fact that there are whole phrases that are copied, the fact that the events that took place in the Old Testament happened in the exact same order, in the exact same progression, the exact same progression and everything like that in the New Testament. All of those, that cumulatively leads us to believe that there's no way that these stories are distinct from one another. Now, it's important to know that this is just the story that we know in the Gospels. I mean, for all I know, Jesus could have come by and done some kind of magic trick where he produced a whole bunch of loaves of bread and fish, like any illusionist would, and convince people that this happens. But the stories that we have as they are written in the Gospels, those are definitely inspired and connected to the Old Testament, which kind of obfuscates any kind of real historical event that could have happened. Because then it's like, well, we don't know. How would we know that this actually happened if the only sources that we have on this very obviously copied and changed stories from the Old Testament that they already knew and just sort of pasted them on top of this Jesus character? There's no way for us to know that this story actually happened because of that fact. So it's not just speculatively saying, oh well, something similar happened in the Old Testament, so that means that they just used it for the New Testament. What we're talking about is doing like an actual textual analysis, comparing the two stories, comparing the progression of events, and comparing Greek phrases that appear in both that are exactly the same. So it's a little bit more harder of evidence than just the casualness criteria. I feel like the casualness criteria involves a little bit more subjective like interpretation as to how casual these are, because I understand that you find them to be very casual references, but when I look at them, I don't see casual references. What I see are crafted stories that the authors use in order to tell the story that they wanted to. Like they wanted to tell this story in the way that they did, so they changed the stories around. They redacted previous gospels. That sometimes they even made up information in order to tell the story that they wanted to. And so that's why it doesn't seem casual to me, because it seems crafted specifically to tell that story that they wanted to.